The armor was a ruin. There was no charitable word for it. The left pauldron had been sheared away cleanly, not by a blade but by some sustained, close-range plasma discharge that had melted the mounting bracket into a warped ring of oxidized alloy. The chest plate bore 3 overlapping scorch channels that ran diagonally from right collarbone to left hip, each wide enough to press a thumb into. The composite beneath bubbled and re-hardened in ridges. The helmet was intact but badly dented along the right temporal region, the impact having deformed the inner sealing ring just enough that the faceplate's thermal lock no longer cycled properly, which meant the faceplate itself had to be held shut from inside with one gloved hand, unless the wearer wanted it swinging open at the worst moment. None of that was fixed. The soldier inside it, designation Rail Corvan, First Contact Liaison, Earth Expeditionary Convoy, currently the sole surviving member of said convoy, had no tools, no replacement parts, and no particular interest in cosmetics. He had, however, been forced to cross the main ceremonial hall of Thronespire Kethvener 3 times in the last 6 hours, and on each of those crossings, he had passed within 20 meters of Queen Sereth Vel Anharis of the Anhari Dominion, and on each of those crossings, she had made a point of watching him do it. He noticed things. It was, for better or worse, most of what his training had produced. On the 3rd crossing, she said something. He heard the Anhari first, a soft, clipped phrase, like a small stone dropped into a still cistern, and then the translation came through his earpiece half a second later in the flat synthetic voice of the corridor relay unit. It had some trouble with register. The relay had been calibrated for diplomatic exchange, not court mockery, and so what it rendered was technically accurate but emotionally arid. The human's outer shell appears to have lost an argument with something larger. Laughter came from the lower tier of the hall, not from the queen herself. She was standing at the far edge of the upper dais, arms loose at her sides, the long silver-white ceremonial robe pooling slightly at her feet, and her expression from this distance was unreadable. But the 6 retainers arranged on the step below her laughed clearly, and 2 of the court observers near the eastern pillar were covering their mouths with the long sleeves of their attendants' wraps. Rail stopped walking. He did not turn all the way around. He turned enough that the unsheared right pauldron was toward her, and the sheared-away gap on the left was not, which wasn't pride, just habit. You orient the least compromised side toward an unknown. He looked at her across the hall. She was looking at him. They were not close enough for him to read her face precisely, but they were close enough that the looking was mutual and deliberate. He reached up with his right hand, pressed the thermal lock override on the faceplate, and let it swing open. The laughter stopped. Not tapered, stopped, as if something cut it. Queen Sereth Vel Anharis looked at his face. She was known. The relay unit had given him 11 pages of biographical notations, which he'd read the night before because he read things when he wasn't sleeping, and he hadn't been sleeping much, as a woman who did not visibly react to things. 34 years of age by the Dominion standard, which mapped loosely to late 20s by Earth reckoning, 8 years on the throne, a military career before that which had made her the youngest decorated fleet commander in the Anhari's last border conflict. She had, the notation said, survived 3 assassination attempts, a political exile, and the collapse of the treaty that had killed her father. She had, in all the photographic and archival records the relay could access, never been photographed off balance. She froze. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then her expression smoothed back into something neutral, and she turned away from him and said something quietly to the retainer nearest to her shoulder, and the retainer nodded, and the queen of the Anhari Dominion went back to whatever she had been doing before she decided to mock a damaged suit of human armor in the middle of her own ceremonial hall. Rail closed the faceplate, pressed the override to hold it shut, and kept walking. He did not look back at the queen as he walked. He'd been in rooms where people had looked at him before, interrogation rooms mostly, and a few diplomatic holding cells, and once a market square on a colony station where he'd been the first human most of the inhabitants had seen, and the looking in that square had been relentless in the way of people who did not know they were staring. He'd learned, over 12 years of first contact work, to let the looking happen. People looked at things they didn't understand. It wasn't hostile, mostly. It was just what looking was for. The Queen's looking had been different. He didn't have a more precise word for it yet. Different was sufficient for now. He found his way back to the logistics bay, where the settler accommodation paperwork was being processed, and got back to work. There was a great deal of it. The manifest cross-reference alone had taken him 4 hours the previous day, and there were still 2 names that the Anhari arrival registry had logged differently from the Aldrich Venn ***'s own records. Different transliteration of a vowel, most likely, but he needed to confirm it before the official documentation was filed, or it would cause problems at the repatriation end. He sat down, pulled up the relay, and started going through the names. He had the capacity to set things aside while he was working and return to them later. He'd developed it over 12 years, and it had become, in the way of practice skills, somewhat automatic. The faceplate moment went into a drawer. He'd think about it later. He worked until the corridor lights shifted to the evening cycle, which the Anhari apparently ran on a 20-hour schedule, slightly shorter than Earth standard, which meant his sleep timing was going to be off for the next several weeks, which was fine. He was already not sleeping much, and a differently timed not sleeping was not significantly worse than the regular kind. He found a quiet section of the accommodation wing and sat against the wall and opened the relay's downloaded briefing files. He had not meant to be here. This was the most accurate way to put it, and also the most useless, because not meaning to be somewhere didn't change the fact of being there. And in 12 years of service, Rail had learned that the most expensive thing in any crisis was spending time on what should have happened instead of what had. So he'd done that calculation once, in the first hour, in the dark of the wreck, pressed against the emergency locker while the atmosphere vented, and then he'd filed it and gotten on with the situation. The situation was as follows. Earth's first contact expeditionary convoy had been carrying a diplomatic team and 412 civilian settlers to a newly registered habitation zone on the outer ring of the Anhari Dominion's contested border region. Not inside the Dominion, technically, but close enough that courtesy notification had been filed with the Anhari Trade Council 6 months before departure. The convoy had been 3 days out from the habitation zone when a navigational error compounded by an equipment fault had pushed the lead ship, the **Aldrich Venn**, into a micro-debris field that the charts had listed as sparse. It was not sparse. 2 ships went down. The **Aldrich Venn managed to limp far enough to make a controlled crash landing on the nearest solid body, which turned out to be an uninhabited outer province moon of the Anhari Dominion, which was technically inside their territorial boundary, which was an accident, but also the sort of accident that looked very much like an incursion, depending on which side of the story you were approaching from. 412 settlers, a diplomatic team, and the wreckage of 2 vessels on Anhari sovereign territory. The Anhari response had arrived in 2 hours. 14 vessels, Queen's insignia, which meant the Dominion had decided this warranted direct attention and not just a patrol handoff. They had been, in the circumstances, extremely professional. No weapons discharged, no injuries on either side, orderly processing of the settlers into temporary accommodation, careful logging of every human name and designation, full translation relay established within 40 minutes. The Dominion ran its territory efficiently. Rail had to give it that. What had also arrived, apparently, was Queen Sereth herself. Rail had not known this until the 3rd hour when one of the junior protocol officers, a slight Anhari woman named Veth, who had the large amber eyes and the faintly luminescent pale gray skin common to the Anhari, and who had been assigned to translate for him personally, had mentioned it quietly, and with a faint edge of anxiety that suggested she thought he should already know. She came herself, Rail had said. She was already in this sector, Veth said. Fleet maneuvers, it was close. When the landing was flagged, she redirected. He'd processed that. The queen of a multi-system dominion, in the middle of fleet exercises, had personally redirected to supervise the processing of a crash-landed convoy of civilian settlers and one battered liaison officer. That was either a protocol escalation, treating it as a significant diplomatic event, or something else. He didn't have enough information yet to know which. "Am I going to speak with her?" he'd asked. "That's being determined," Veth said, which was not a no. The determination had taken another 4 hours, during which he'd crossed the ceremonial hall 3 times on various administrative errands, and the Queen had noticed him on all 3 crossings, and on the 3rd one she'd made the remark about his armor, and he'd opened his faceplate. He still wasn't entirely sure why he'd done that. It wasn't strategic. Opening a damaged faceplate in a room full of strangers was not a security-conscious move. It wasn't planned. She'd said something aimed at making him feel small and strange in her hall, and something in him had responded before the thinking part had time to weigh in, and the response had been, "Here, then. This is what's inside." Whatever it was she'd seen, it had made her freeze. He filed that too, and went to find Veth to ask about the status of the settler accommodation. The accommodation was adequate. The settlers were frightened, most of them. The crash had not been gentle, and there had been injuries, nothing critical but enough to remind everyone that the situation was real. The Anhari medical staff had been thorough, and their equipment was significantly more sophisticated than anything the *Aldrich Ven* had carried. Rail had checked in with each of the 412 by name, which had taken 2 hours. He was not the diplomatic team's lead, that had been Commander Yasara 10, who had not survived the crash, which was a grief he was also filing for later because right now there was no space for it. But he was the senior surviving personnel, and they were his people. He found a corner of the accommodation wing to sit in and went through the relay's 11 pages again. Not the biographical notes, the territorial law section, which was denser and which he'd skimmed the first time. The relevant provision was this: emergency landing by foreign nationals on sovereign Anhari territory, if non-hostile in cause and manner, fell under the Kethvera provision, which was a 200-year-old law established after a different kind of crash, a different kind of planet, a different set of people trying to figure out what to do next. Under the Kethvera provision, the sovereign authority of the territory was responsible for the welfare of emergency-landed foreign nationals for up to 30 days. After 30 days, formal repatriation or extended residency status had to be negotiated. The convoy's own rescue team would take at minimum 18 days to mount a response. He'd already transmitted the distress signal. He'd already received the acknowledgement. 18 days minimum, possibly 25. They were inside the 30-day window, but only just. The sovereign authority in this case was Queen Serath Vel Anharis. Her decision about how to apply the provision generously, minimally, or technically would determine what the next 3 to 4 weeks looked like for 412 civilians. He closed the relay file and thought about how she'd looked at him across the hall. Veth came for him the next morning. "She'll see you," Veth said. "In the particular way that meant she has decided to see you, and this is not optional *." And Rail stood up from the cot he'd been sitting on, adjusted the thermal lock on the faceplate with his right hand, and followed. The room they were taken to was not the ceremonial hall. It was smaller, more functional, a working room, which in Anhari design meant long data surfaces along one wall, a central table with 4 chairs, and very large windows. The windows looked out over the moon's surface, which was bare and reddish pale in the low-angle light, and beyond it the curve of the planet the moon orbited, enormous and banded deep amber with white cloud streaks. It was, despite everything, a remarkable view. Queen Sarath was already in the room. She was not in the ceremonial robe. She was wearing what Rael guessed was a working uniform, dark, close-fitting, with the Anhari rank insignia on the left shoulder rather than the more elaborate ceremonial markings. And she was standing at the window looking out when he came in, and she turned when he did. She was taller than he'd estimated from across the hall. Anhari build tended toward lean and long-limbed. She had the usual pale gray skin with the faint inner luminosity that was specific to her bloodline. The court records had noted it, something about a genetic marker from the original founding sept, and her hair was white-silver, pulled back in a flat braid that fell between her shoulder blades. Her eyes were the color he hadn't been sure about from a distance, a deep amber, warm rather than cool, with a dark ring at the outer edge of the iris that was almost the color of burnt honey. She had the look of someone who spent a great deal of time assessing things, and had learned to do it without her face telling you she was doing it. She was assessing him. He let her. Veth moved to the corner to take her translation position, and Rael came to the table and stopped. He didn't sit. It wasn't an invitation to sit yet. He waited. The Queen said something in Anhari. Veth translated, "You're taller than the file indicated." "The file is 3 years old," Rael said. "The armor adds something." She looked at the armor. Her expression didn't change, but there was something in the small pause that followed that he recognized as the controlled override of an impulse. She'd thought about referencing the damage or the mockery of the day before and decided against it. "Sit," she said in Anhari, and Veth translated and they both sat. What followed was 2 hours of logistics. The Queen was direct and well briefed. She had clearly read her own documentation on the Kethvara provision, and on the *Aldrich Ven *S distress signal response timeline, and on the passenger manifest, which she had read all the way through. He could tell because her questions about individual settlers were specific, not generic. She wanted to know about the 3 with significant injuries. She wanted to know whether any of the children had family among the adult survivors or whether there were unaccompanied minors. She wanted to know the actual minimum functional standard for the settler accommodation wing, because the notation in the provision was vague, and she was going to apply it correctly. He answered everything she asked. She had a way of asking questions that was efficient without being clipped. She gave him enough context to know what specifically she needed, rather than a broad question that would make him guess at the relevant subset of information. It saved time. He found himself adapting to the pattern within the first 20 minutes. She asked specifically, he answered specifically, she moved on. There was no social scaffolding around it. No preamble, no throat clearing, no diplomatic softening. Just the problem being worked. He asked some questions of his own, about the medical team's timeline for the injured, about whether there was a way to get the settlers' personal equipment logs out of the wreck, about how long the Anhari standard considered a minor to be unaccompanied before they activated the family liaison protocol, because he had 4 children whose adult relatives were injured, and he needed to know when the clock started. She answered those 2 directly, without ornament. For the last one she paused briefly, not because she didn't know, he thought, but because she was deciding whether to give him the precise legal answer or the practical one. She gave him both. He wrote down both. They were, Rael thought, 2 people doing a complicated logistics problem. Whatever the mockery of the day before had been, this room didn't have it. This room had the problem and the working through of it, and she was, he realized with some clarity, genuinely good at this. Not performing competence. Actually competent in the specific way that people were competent when they'd done hard things under actual pressure and learned from the doing. He'd worked with diplomats who wore competence like a flag and fell apart when the actual decisions became load-bearing. This was not that. She was thinking. She was actually tracking the full shape of the situation. At one point he mentioned, somewhat obliquely, that 2 of the children had been asking about the planetary formations visible from the accommodation windows. The children were young, 7 and 8, and frightened and also clearly fascinated, and he'd told them he'd try to find out whether anyone could explain what they were seeing. He wasn't sure why he mentioned it. It was not a logistics matter. She looked at him for a half-second, and then made a brief note on the data surface beside her, and moved on without commenting on it. The next morning there was a child-specific orientation packet in the accommodation wing's information relay, with the planetary formations labeled and explained in simple language, with illustrations. He didn't ask who had sent it. At the end of the 2 hours she stood, and he stood, and she said something, and Veth translated. The accommodation will be expanded. The injured will be moved to the primary medical wing. The children with unaccompanied status will be assigned a dedicated Anhari family liaison until repatriation. He hadn't asked for any of those things. They were above the minimum standard of the provision by a significant margin. "Thank you," he said. "That's generous, more than required." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said in Anhari something that Veth translated carefully. "The provision says what is required. I decide what is done." He nodded. "Then I'm grateful for the distinction." She left. He stood at the window for a while and looked at the banded planet. He saw her again on the 3rd day. Not an arranged meeting. The next scheduled session was on day 5, to review medical status. This was him walking along the exterior observation ring. The moon's surface was breathable but cold, and the spire's outer ring was an enclosed promenade of clear composite panels that gave a view of the surface and sky. And her being there, standing at the far end, alone except for 2 guards at the far entrance who clearly knew to stay far enough back to be technically present without being audibly present. He stopped when he saw her, because she'd clearly come here for solitude, and he turned to go back. She said in Anhari something that Veth, who was not here, could not translate. He turned back. She said it again, and gestured. A small controlled motion of her right hand that even without context read as * "don't go." He stopped. She looked at the surface for a while. He looked at it too. It was a particular kind of landscape, bare rock, reddish, with long low ridges that the low-angle sun caught at the edges, and in the distance a dry basin where something had evaporated long ago and left mineral striations in pale bands. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was old in a way that made you feel the age of it. He'd found in 12 years of this work that very old planetary surfaces sometimes did that, communicated something about time that a person couldn't entirely think through and could only sit with. This one had that quality strongly. The basin especially, the pale mineral bands arranged in layers, each one a different density, a different depth. Something had been there, water or something functionally similar, and it had taken a very long time to leave. There was a precision to the record that the basin kept. Every layer was a duration. She said something again, softer. Then she turned to look at him, and he met her eyes, and he understood without translation, because some things weren't about the words that she was asking him something. What he'd thought of the surface, maybe, or just, "Do you see it too?" "Yes," he said. "Whatever you're asking, yes." It was a strange answer to give to a question he hadn't understood. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face shifted in a way that he couldn't name precisely. Not warmth exactly, not thaw, but a kind of recalibration, as if she'd measured something and was revising her result. He thought about what he'd said to himself in the first hour in the wreck * file it, move on, and he thought that she probably did something structurally similar, that the recalibration, the revision, was the version of that process she used. Take in new information. Adjust, continue. Then she turned back to the window, and he stood at his end of the ring, and they stayed there together for another 20 minutes without speaking, and then she left. He stayed another 10 minutes after that. The low-angle light was doing something specific to the right edge of the farthest ridge, catching it in a way that made it glow amber briefly before the sun moved and the glow was gone. He watched it happen. He thought, If there were a word for that in Anhari, she would know it. He thought. He'd like to know it too. On day 4, the armor stopped holding together. He'd expected it. The thermal lock on the faceplate had been deteriorating since the crash, and on day 4 it failed entirely. The override mechanism stripped, and the faceplate swung open and stayed open without his hand on it. He could hold it shut with the glove, but only if he kept his hand there, which made doing things with his right hand more complicated. The left side chest plate had developed a secondary crack along the second scorch channel, spreading toward the shoulder, and the composite was delaminating. It wouldn't shear, not in normal movement, but it was compromised in a way that should have sent it to a repair bay 3 days ago. Veth found him in the accommodation wing, standing in the corridor trying to hold the faceplate shut while also sorting the children's equipment logs, and she looked at him with the particular expression that he'd learned in 4 days meant she was going to say something carefully. "There is," she said, "an armorer on the Spire staff." I know. He'd seen the notation in the facility inventory the relay had pulled on day 1. "I don't have access." "You could request access." He looked at her. "Through what channel?" "Through me if you want," Veth said. "Or I could tell you that the channel for that request goes through the Senior Protocol's office, and the Senior Protocol's office reports to the Chamberlain, and the Chamberlain is Sarath Oven. And Sarath Oven this week is taking all requests of this type directly to the Queen, because the normal authorizations are suspended while we're in provisional occupation status. And the Queen has told Sarath Oven that she wants to know about anything that touches on the visiting human coordinator's situation." He stood still for a moment, then he said, "She's been following the details." "She reviews the situation reports herself," Veth said. "In the evenings, I've seen the access logs." He thought about that. He thought about 2 hours of logistics and specific questions about injured settlers and the children's family liaisons, and the banded planet through the window. "Ask Sarath Oven," he said, "please." The authorization came through in 2 hours. The armorer was a large, quiet Anhari man named Death Koravan. The similarity to his own name produced a moment of mutual bemusement that served as an icebreaker, who looked at the armor for 30 seconds, and then exhaled slowly through his nose in a way that communicated something in any language. "How long has it been like this?" Death asked. 6 days, Rael said. 6 days, Death repeated flatly. "In this condition." There wasn't a repair option at the crash site. Death looked at the sheared pauldron, the 3 scorched channels, the delaminated plate, the stripped faceplate lock. He looked at Rael. He said in Anhari something that Veth translated with a slight suppression of amusement as, "I am going to need you to explain to me how a human being arrives in this state and is still standing." "Practice," Rael said. The repair work took 2 days. Death could not restore the original pauldron. The mounting bracket was too damaged, but he fabricated a replacement in Anhari alloy that actually fit better than the original had, and the scorched channels he filled with a composite patch that he finished flush and smooth enough that the chest plate looked, if not new, at least whole. The faceplate lock he rebuilt from the ground up, and when he was done it cycled with a clean precision that the original hadn't had since about 8 months before the crash. On the second afternoon of the repair work, when Rael was sitting in the armorer's workshop and Death was at the bench doing fine work on the faceplate assembly, he looked up and Queen Sarath was standing in the doorway. She was in her working uniform again. She looked at him, then at the workbench, then at Death, who had stood and was waiting. She said something briefly to Death, and Death replied and she nodded, and then she looked at Rael. Veth, to her credit, had followed at a discreet distance and was near enough to translate when needed. The Queen said something. "She says," Veth murmured, "that she wanted to see how it was coming along." "It's coming along well," Rael said. "Death does excellent work." She said something else. Veth waited a beat and then translated. She says she had not realized when she spoke in the hall that the damage was so extensive. She says this is a direct quote, "I spoke about what I could see, without considering what I could not." Rael looked at the Queen. She was watching him with the contained, level expression that he'd come to understand was not coldness. Was, in fact, the opposite, something carefully held in. The way a very precise person held things carefully, because they'd learned that held carefully was better than spilled. "The armor's just armor," he said. "The comment didn't land somewhere important." She heard the translation and then looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that Veth translated with a slight pause. She says, "That's not the point." He considered that. "Then I accept," he said. "And I appreciate that you said so." She stayed for another 20 minutes, asking Death questions about the repair process, which he answered with the quiet enthusiasm of a craftsman who rarely had his craft noticed at this level. Rael watched her do this, the questions, the attention to the answers, the way she remembered what Death had said and built the next question from it. She was genuinely curious. He'd expected someone performing interest. What he was watching was actual interest. She left before Death finished for the evening, and Rael sat with his repaired faceplate clicking cleanly shut in his hand. The Day 5 meeting was more complicated than logistics. The medical update was positive. The 3 serious injuries were healing. 2 of the settlers had been cleared for regular movement, and the 3rd would need another 2 weeks but was expected to make a full recovery. Rael had taken notes on all of it personally, because the notes would be part of his debrief to Earth Command when repatriation came, and he wanted them precise. The cardiologist liaison had been thorough and had, at one point, addressed a question directly to Rael about whether Earth Command's rescue convoy could be expected to carry an adequate cardiac monitoring unit, and Rael had answered honestly, probably adequate, but not to Anhari standard. The cardiologist had made a note. The Queen had watched this exchange without interrupting. After the medical portion concluded and the cardiologist liaison had left, the room was quiet for a moment. The Queen looked at the data surface where the medical update was still displayed, and then she looked at Rael, and she said something that Veth took a beat to translate. She says she wants to ask you something that isn't on the agenda. "Go ahead," he said. She asked. Veth translated carefully. "When you opened the faceplate in the hall on the first day, why did you do it?" He thought about the answer for a moment. He thought about what he'd filed in the drawer and said he'd think about later, and he thought, "This is later." "I don't have a fully calculated answer for that," he said. "You said something that was aimed at making my situation feel small, and something in me responded before I'd thought it through. The response was, here is what's inside. If you're going to speak about the shell, you should know what you're speaking about." Veth translated. The Queen listened. She was very still when she listened. He had noticed, not the stillness of disengagement but of concentrated attention, the way a person stilled themselves when they were trying to catch every word. Then she looked down at the table for a moment. There was a slight tension across her shoulders that had not been there at the beginning of the meeting. She said something, slowly. Veth translated. She says she has been thinking about it since the moment it happened. She says she was looking at damaged equipment and speaking about damaged equipment, and then suddenly she was looking at a person. She says the distinction arrived very abruptly. "I'm aware of how it looked," Rael said. "A bad suit of armor walking through someone else's hall." She says she was not thinking of it as a bad suit of armor. She was thinking of it as a symbol of something she did not respect. And then she was wrong, and she knew it immediately, and she has found that difficult to put down. He sat with that. He thought about what 12 years of first contact work had taught him about what happened when a person discovered the thing they were certain about had been a frame rather than a fact. Some people rebuilt quickly. Some didn't rebuild at all. They held harder to the original frame because the alternative was too disorienting. And some people held the wrongness very precisely, in the specific uncomfortable way that people who cared about being accurate held things they'd gotten wrong, because to hold it precisely was to ensure they didn't get it wrong again. She was the third kind. He could see it in the way she was looking at the table rather than at him. Not shame, exactly, something more exacting than that. A careful accounting. "What did she see?" he asked, "when I opened it?" Veth translated the question. The Queen looked at him. She said something brief. Veth said, "She says she is not ready to answer that yet." He nodded. "Then she doesn't have to." She looked at him, and the slight tension in her shoulders resolved, and she was composed again. He thought about what it meant that the answer to "you don't have to" had been something that resolved rather than braced, as if she'd been waiting to find out whether he'd push, and the answer had been no, and the no mattered. On day 8 there was a complication. One of the settlers, an older man named Fen Caro, who had been in the second wave of crash survivors, and who had a history of cardiac stress that hadn't been flagged in the pre-departure medical clearance because it had been subclinical, had a significant cardiac event in the accommodation wing. The Anhari medical team responded in 4 minutes and stabilized him, but it was 4 minutes that Rael spent crouching on the floor of the corridor with Fen's hand in both of his, talking steadily about nothing, keeping Fen's attention on his voice rather than on the fear, until the team arrived. The Anhari cardiologist, a composed woman named Uru Veth Serral, no relation to Veth, told him afterward that Fen would likely survive and would certainly need extended care, possibly beyond the repatriation window. He sat down in the corridor when she left and put his back against the wall and did not think about anything for a few minutes, which was a luxury he couldn't afford much of, but Fen was 73, and he'd been one of the first settlers to sit down with Rael on day 1 and tell him that everything was going to be fine in a way that made it clear Fen believed it, and Rael had needed that more than he'd shown. And so he sat in the corridor for a few minutes and allowed himself to feel the particular weight of how close things had been. The Queen found him there. Or rather, he became aware after an indeterminate amount of time that he was not alone and looked up and she was standing nearby. Not looming, standing at a respectful distance, which meant she'd arrived some time ago and was simply present without demand. She didn't have Veth with her. She had one guard who was also at a respectful distance. She said something. Without Veth, he didn't catch the content, just the register, quiet, not formal. He said, "I don't have a translator." She nodded. She seemed to have already known this, or calculated it, or not cared. She came closer and crouched beside him, which was a peculiar thing for the Queen of a multi-system dominion to do, and she looked at him from that position, and he looked at her. She said something very short. He didn't know the word, but it was soft, and the way she said it had the shape of, "Is he all right?" "He's stable," Rael said. "He'll be okay, probably." She listened to the tone rather than the words, he thought, because she nodded as if she'd understood the substance of it. They stayed like that, her crouched at his level, him with his back against the wall, for a while. It was a strange thing to share with someone he'd known for 8 days, in a building that was hers and a situation that was entirely not what either of them had planned. But the strangeness was more quiet than uncomfortable. She had the quality, he was finding, of being a very still kind of presence. Not cold still, settled still. Like someone who had learned that stillness was one of the useful things a person could offer. Eventually she said something else, 2 words, or maybe 3, and stood up. He stood up too. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said something careful, and he didn't have to understand the language to understand the sense of it. "Let me know how he does." "I will," he said. She turned and went back down the corridor, and the guard followed. He stood in the corridor for another minute, and then he went back to work. On day 12, Fen Caro was sitting up and demanding to know when breakfast was, which was when Rael knew he was genuinely going to be fine. He sent word through Veth to the Queen's office as she'd asked. He received 3 hours later through the same channel a response that Veth translated as, "She says good. She says she is glad." There was also, with the message, a small data chip that Veth handed him without comment. He asked what it was. Veth said she didn't know. He plugged it into the relay reader and found a partial lexicon, Harry, converted to audio and text both, 430 words, organized not alphabetically but by context of use. The first section was emergency and medical vocabulary. The second was logistical and operational. The third was labeled in the relay's translation, something like conversation words, ordinary, please, thank you, how are you, I understand, I don't understand, yes, I see it too. He stared at that last phrase for a while. Yes, I see it too. He'd said that to her on the observation ring on day 3, in English, in answer to a question she'd asked in Harry that he hadn't understood, and he'd guessed at the content. Apparently he'd guessed correctly. And apparently she'd noted it, and organized a lexicon around it, and included that phrase as one of 430. He worked through the lexicon that evening. He was not good at it, 12 years of work across 17 different alien contacts, and he'd picked up functional phrases in 8 languages, and was genuinely proficient in none of them. But he went through it carefully, audio and text, until he had maybe 60 words that he felt he could produce reliably without embarrassing himself. On day 13, he passed her in the corridor near the Eastern Administrative Section, and she looked at him, and he said in Harry something that he was almost certain meant asterisk good morning or something close to it. She stopped walking. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said in Harry, slowly and clearly enough that he caught most of it, something about it was, apparently, afternoon. Right, he said in Harry, which was one of the 60. Sorry. She looked at him for another moment. Then, for the first time, he saw her almost smile, not quite, not fully, but the edges of it, a slight thing that lasted perhaps a second and then resolved back into composed. She said something else and walked on. He asked Veth later. Veth said the Queen had said, the mistake is understandable, the effort is not. He filed that in the category of things he intended to think about carefully. On day 15, the rescue convoy's updated timeline came through. 22 days, not 18. A routing issue, a delay in clearance from the Border Transit Authority. Nothing dramatic, just another 4 days. He reported it to the Queen at their scheduled afternoon session. She listened and then looked at the data herself, and then said something to Veth that Veth translated as, she says the provision window is not a concern. She wants to know whether the delay changes any of the settlers' medical situations. He went through the list. Fencaro was the most significant. 22 days put him at a reasonable point in his cardiac recovery, but still short of ideal. The Queen listened, and then said something to the cardiologist liaison who was present for medical matters, and they had a brief exchange, and then she turned back to Rail and said, through Veth, if the convoy's medical facilities are inadequate for his transport, he stays. He has the option. We'll arrange his repatriation separately when he's ready. That's an open-ended commitment, Rail said. Yes, the Queen said, through Veth, but she also said it herself in Harry, directly at him, in the way that he now recognized as her indicating that this was not a negotiating position. It is. He thought about the settlement, about the decision that was above the minimum and below the maximum, about what she'd said on day 5. I decide what is done. Thank you, he said. He'll be grateful. He doesn't need to be grateful, she said, through Veth. He needs to be well. Those are different problems. On day 17, she came to find him herself. He was in the observation ring again. He'd been going there in the late evenings, when the low-angle light was at its most particular, because the light did something to the mineral basin in the distance that was worth seeing. And she arrived at the far end, which was her end, the end she'd been standing at on day 3. She had Veth with her this time. They stood at their respective ends for a while. The basin was catching the light in the pale bands, and the planet above was in a phase where 2 of its storm bands were visible as dark curves along the lower hemisphere. The planet was large enough in the sky that when the viewing angle was right you could see the cloud movement, slow, enormous, the turning of something that weighed more than all the rock he'd ever stood on, continuous and indifferent and very beautiful. "I've been trying to learn the names," Rael said finally, "of the formations in the basin. The lexicon you sent didn't have them." Veth translated. The Queen looked at him and something shifted in her expression, a small recalibration, the kind he'd learned to watch for. Then she walked the length of the observation ring to his end, which she hadn't done on day 3, and stood beside him and looked at the basin. She pointed at the leftmost of the pale mineral bands and said a word. He repeated it. She shook her head slightly and said it again, with a different vowel. There was a quality in Anhari vowels that he was only beginning to hear, a depth or weight that the relay's synthesized translation flattened out, and which in actual speech was information. He repeated the corrected version. She nodded. She named 3 more features of the basin, pointing at each. He repeated each one. She corrected 2 of them with the same patient, precise manner, shaking her head, repeating the word, waiting for him to try again. The 3rd he apparently got right because she said in Anhari a word he knew by now. Yes. They stood looking at the basin together, and she named things, and he repeated them, and the planet turned slowly overhead. She went through 12 formations in the basin and the 2 prominent ridges visible from this angle, and then she named the basin itself, a longer word, a proper name, and when he repeated it she was quiet for a moment and he wondered if he'd gotten it wrong, and then she said in Anhari something short that Veth translated as, nearly, the 2nd syllable longer. He said it again, she nodded. "What does it mean?" he asked. She looked at the basin. She spoke and Veth translated. "The word means the place that remembers what was here, not the place where something was, the place that is still holding the record." He looked at the pale mineral bands, every layer a duration. "That's exactly right," he said. She looked at him when Veth translated that, and something in her face was very still, the particular stillness of attention rather than absence. And then she said something about the way the light was moving across the basin. The amber ridge glow he'd watched alone on day 3, and he said, in Anhari, the phrase from the lexicon, "I see it too," using it this time as what it was actually meant, as not a guess. She looked at him. He had, in 17 days, learned to read something of her face. Not all of it, she was, even by the standards of people who kept things in, exceptional at keeping things in, but the edges of things. The slight changes that preceded the deliberate smoothing over. She looked at him now with something in her face that was not yet resolved into neutral, that she had not smoothed over, and he looked back, and neither of them looked away. Then she said something to Veth quietly. Veth translated. She says she would like to tell you what she saw when you opened the faceplate, if you still want to know. He had asked on day 5. She'd said she wasn't ready. He'd said she didn't have to. And now it was day 17, and she was standing beside him in the last light of the basin that remembered everything, and she was ready. "Yes," he said, "please." She looked at the basin for a moment, then she turned to look at him. She spoke steadily, and Veth translated piece by piece, careful with it, because she was being careful with it, and the translation needed to hold the care. She says she looked at the armor and she saw a symbol. The symbol was of something she didn't respect, a foreign power in her territory, in a situation that should not have required her personal attention, in equipment that told her they had not taken the approach of the Dominion seriously enough to arrive in good repair. She says that was her assumption. She says she is telling you the assumption so you understand what she was acting from when she spoke in the hall. She says, and then you opened the faceplate. She says she was looking at a symbol and then she was looking at a face. She says she does not have a precise word for what she saw in your face, but the closest she can put is someone who has been carrying this for a long time and has not once put it down. Not the crash, not the situation, the whole thing, all of it, however long it's been. She says she had made an assumption, and suddenly it wasn't the situation and she didn't know what the situation was. She says she has been in rooms where she has had to revise her understanding of something. She says it does not usually take 3 seconds. She says it does not usually take 17 days to completely finish the revision. She says that is what the freezing was. She says it was the moment when she understood that she had not been looking at what was there. Rael listened to all of it. The basin was quiet below them. The planet moved overhead. He thought about the thing she'd said, someone who has been carrying this for a long time and has not once put it down, and he thought that was accurate. He hadn't known it showed. He'd thought the filing system was sufficient. He'd thought the putting away was indistinguishable from the not having. She'd looked at his face for 3 seconds and seen that it was not. The armor really is just armor, he said after a moment, but I appreciate you telling me what you saw underneath it. She said something brief. Veth translated. She says yes, she knows that now. He looked at her. In the last of the light, the amber of her eyes was very deep, and the outer ring was almost dark, and she was looking at him with the expression she didn't smooth over, the one she let stay on her face when she had decided something should stay. He thought about what it had cost her to say that, not the saying itself, but the whole shape of it, the mockery in the hall, the freeze, the 17 days of carrying it carefully, and now this, the full accounting offered voluntarily to the person she'd gotten wrong. He said in Anhari, not the formal word but the ordinary one from the 3rd section of the lexicon, the one labeled asterisk conversation words, ordinary, asterisk I'm glad. She looked at him for a long moment. The planet continued overhead. Then she said in Anhari carefully, as if she'd been thinking about how to put it for a while, so am I. On day 22, the rescue convoy arrived. It was 3 ships, not the largest Earth Command could mount, but well configured for a full settler repatriation, including a medical transport for Fen Caro, whose cardiologist, Dr. Uru Veth Serral, had agreed that he was stable enough to make the journey with appropriate monitoring. Fen had personally informed Rael that he was not going to have a second cardiac event just to stay in a building with a nicer view, which was, Rael thought, the most characteristic thing he'd heard Fen say. The loading took most of the morning. 412 settlers, plus equipment, plus the preliminary diplomatic packages that would need to be processed through the proper channels before any formal first contact status was established. It was orderly. The Anhari ground staff had been efficient and patient through 22 days. They were efficient and patient through the loading as well. Rael supervised it all and checked off every name and shook every hand he could get to, and stood at the loading ramp of the last civilian transport and watched it lift. Queen Sereth came to the primary landing pad for the departure. She didn't have to. It was not required by protocol. The departure was being handled at a mid-level diplomatic tier, below the formal first contact threshold, which was still months of paperwork away, and a queen showing up to see off a logistics coordinator was several grades above what the situation technically called for. He saw her arrive, and he thought about what she'd said on day 5, and he thought, she decides what is done. She waited until the last civilian transport was up. Then she walked across the pad to where he was standing at his own ship, the remaining piece of the asterisk Aldrich Ven that was flyable, a compact liaison craft that had been in the secondary bay and taken no direct impact damage, and which had been repaired by Death Coravan's team along with the armor. She had Veth with her. She also had the Queen's standard bearer and 2 guards, because apparently this was going to be at the level of a formal goodbye, and Rael straightened up and composed himself accordingly. She looked at the armor, the repaired armor, The Anhariali pauldron, the patched chest plate, the clean faceplate that cycled correctly. She said something and Veth translated. She says it's better. Death does excellent work, he said. I've said that before, but it bears repeating. She almost smiled again. It was the second time he'd seen it, and it was the same. The edges of it brief, not quite full, not quite permitted. Then she was composed again. She said something longer. Veth translated. She says the formal first contact documentation will take time. She says she expects the process will require ongoing coordination at the liaison level. She says she has submitted a request to Earth Command's diplomatic registry to designate a specific coordination contact on the Dominion side. Who did she designate? He asked. Veth translated the question, and the Queen looked at him and said one word in Anhari. Veth translated it herself. He stood with that for a moment. I'll make sure the right people know, he said, on our side. She said something brief. Veth translated. She says make sure you are among them. He looked at her. She looked at him with the expression she didn't smooth over, full and direct and settled, the way she'd looked at the basin with him in the last light. I'll make sure of that, he said. She said something quiet, the ordinary word from the ordinary section of the lexicon she'd given him. He recognized it. He answered in the same word, and she looked at him when he said it in Anhari, not surprised, because she'd given him the tools, but something that wasn't not surprised either, something more specific. Then she stepped back, and he climbed into the liaison craft, and the ramp sealed, and he ran the pre-flight check with his right hand on the newly cleaned faceplate lock that cycled perfectly every time. Through the forward window, he could see her on the landing pad. She was watching the craft. She did not look away when the engines ignited. He lifted off. On the nav screen, the Kethvener system fell away behind him, the moon, the banded planet, the amber storm bands. He set the course for the relay point and engaged the drive. He thought about a mineral basin in the last light. He thought about a lexicon organized by context of use, with yes, I see it too in the section labeled conversation words, ordinary. He thought about a woman who looked at damaged armor and said something aimed at a symbol, and then found she was looking at a person instead, and had found that difficult to put down. He thought about the filing system he'd built over 12 years, grief for later, feeling for later, everything in its drawer until there was room for it. He opened the drawer. The formal first contact documentation took 4 months. It was extensive, methodical, and involved 8 diplomatic subcommittees across 2 governments, and it required a great deal of liaison-level coordination, which meant a great deal of communication between the Earth Expeditionary Corps, designated First Contact Coordinator, 1 Rail Corpsman, promoted 1 grade on the strength of a very detailed after-action report filed by a queen who did not have to file it, and the Anhari Dominion's designated coordination contact, who answered her own messages, not through a relay office, not through a secretary direct. The messages were formal. Initially, the subject matter required it. Transfer of documentation, confirmation of subcommittee timelines, clarification of the Kethvera provisions application in the aftermath of the settlement. He answered with the same formality. There were 2 people doing a complicated logistics problem in correspondence. On the 41st message, he counted. He was, as established, someone who noticed things. She sent him a data file alongside the usual subcommittee update. He opened it. It was an extended lexicon, not 430 words. Over 2,000 organized by the same system as the first one, context of use, and the third section, conversation words, ordinary, was substantially longer. He worked through it over 3 weeks in the evenings. On the 53rd message, he wrote the first paragraph in Anhari and the rest in English, and flagged the Anhari paragraph as probably wrong in places. She replied with the Anhari paragraph corrected in red notation and the rest of her response in Anhari. He could read most of it. On the 87th message, 4 months in, the formal documentation signed and filed, the first contact process formally initiated. She wrote something that he translated carefully and then sat with for a while before he answered. She wrote, "The formal process is concluded. The coordination contact designation was for the formal process. I want to ask if you intend to continue corresponding outside the formal requirement." He thought about a mineral basin. He thought about a word repeated until the vowel was right. He thought about a woman who froze for 3 seconds and spent 17 days unfreezing, and who then drove the unfreezing to its conclusion on a landing pad with the straightest eyes he'd ever had aimed at him. He wrote back in Anhari, imperfect, flagged, more wrong than right probably, but in Anhari, "Yes, I intend to continue. I would like to if you're asking." Her reply came in 2 hours, which was faster than her usual response time by about 6 hours. She wrote in Anhari 1 sentence. He translated it 3 times to make sure he had it. "Then we will."